There are stories the government doesn't want you to hear. Cases sealed in unmarked boxes, buried beneath decades of classified stamps and convenient denials. This is one of them. And before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's not an urban legend passed around on internet forums. This happened in 1959, on American soil, funded by American tax dollars, sanctioned by men who believed the ends justified any means. They called it Project Somnus. The public never called it anything, because the public was never supposed to know it existed. We're going back to the height of the Cold War. The Soviets had launched Sputnik 2 years earlier, and America was terrified. Not just of losing the space race, but of losing everything. There were rumors, whispered in the halls of the Pentagon, that the Russians were developing something far more dangerous than missiles or bombs. They were trying to unlock the human mind itself, to create soldiers who didn't need sleep, who couldn't be broken by exhaustion, who could fight and think and kill without ever closing their eyes. So the U.S. military did what it always did when it felt threatened. It started its own program. And it started it in secret. The experiment was simple in concept. Take 5 test subjects. Lock them in a sealed observation chamber. Keep them awake for 15 days using a combination of stimulants, constant surveillance, and environmental manipulation. Document everything. See what happens when the human body and mind are pushed past their natural limits. The goal was to understand human endurance. To find out what happens when sleep, that most fundamental human need, is completely denied. The military wanted data. They wanted answers. What they got was something else entirely. The facility was located at a decommissioned research base in the Nevada desert, far from any civilian population. The chamber itself was approximately 30 feet by 40 feet. Reinforced walls. Soundproofed. Climate-controlled. One-way observation windows made of thick reinforced glass. Inside, there were 5 beds, a bathroom, a small kitchenette, and nothing else. No books. No television. No clocks. The subjects would have no way to track time except by the meals delivered through a secure airlock 3 times a day. They were told they would be compensated handsomely. Told it was for the good of their country. Told they could leave at any time if they simply asked. That last part was a lie, but they didn't know that yet. The 5 subjects were all male, all volunteers for military prisons. Men who'd made mistakes, who'd been promised reduced sentences in exchange for participation. 3 were in their 20s. 2 were in their early 30s. All were in good physical health. All had passed psychological evaluations. They were told the experiment would last 15 days. They were not told what would be used to keep them awake, only that it would be administered through the air circulation system. A gaseous stimulant, colorless and odorless, pumped in at carefully calibrated intervals. The truth was that the researchers weren't entirely sure what the compound would do. It had been tested on animals with promising results. But this would be the first human trial. The first 3 days were unremarkable. The subjects talked, joked, played cards with a deck one of them had smuggled in. They exercised. They ate their meals. They seemed almost bored. The researchers watching from behind the glass took careful notes. Vital signs remained stable. Heart rate slightly elevated, but nothing concerning. Sleep deprivation in the early stages was known to cause irritability and difficulty concentrating. But these men seemed fine. Almost too fine. On the fourth day, that started to change. One of the subjects, identified in the files only as Subject C, began talking to himself. Quiet at first. Muttering under his breath while the others slept, or tried to. Because that was the thing. They couldn't sleep. They would lie down, close their eyes, and their bodies would refuse to let them drift off. The stimulant in the air kept them locked in a state of forced wakefulness, even when they were desperate for rest. Subject C's muttering grew louder. The others told him to shut up. He apologized. Then an hour later, he was doing it again. The researchers noted increased agitation among all subjects. Shorter tempers. Less conversation. More pacing. By day 6, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the chamber. The subjects weren't joking anymore. They barely spoke to each other. Each man had claimed a corner of the room, a territory, and they stayed there. Subject B stood facing the wall for hours at a time, not moving, barely breathing. When researchers used the intercom to ask if he was all right, he didn't respond. Subject A was doing push-ups. Not a normal amount. Hundreds. Thousands. His arms shaking, his face contorted, but he wouldn't stop. When asked why, he said he needed to stay ready. Ready for what? The researchers asked. He didn't answer. Just kept going. Up and down. Up and down. The sound of his breathing filled the chamber. Day 7 was when they started begging. It began with Subject E, the oldest of the group, who walked to the observation window and pressed his palms against the glass. His eyes were bloodshot. His face pale. He asked, very calmly, very politely, if he could please go to sleep now. Just for an hour. Just a few minutes. Please. The researchers told him the experiment required he stay awake. He nodded. He walked away. 10 minutes later he was back, asking again. This time less politely. Then Subject D joined him. Then Subject C. 3 men standing at the glass, begging to sleep, their voices overlapping, growing more desperate. Subject A kept doing push-ups. Subject B kept staring at the wall. The researchers wrote everything down. That night, or what would have been night if the lights in the chamber ever dimmed, Subject E began to scream. Not words. Just sound. A raw, animalistic howl that went on and on and on. The other subjects didn't react. Didn't tell him to stop. Didn't cover their ears. They just stood or sat or paced in their corners, as if the screaming was no more noteworthy than the hum of the ventilation system. Subject E screamed for 41 minutes straight. Then he stopped, sat down, and stared at nothing. The researchers checked his vitals remotely. Elevated heart rate. Elevated blood pressure. But nothing that suggested immediate danger. They decided to continue. Day 9. The chamber had become something else now. The subjects moved differently. Slower. More deliberate. Like they were conserving energy for something. They weren't eating as much anymore. Meals went untouched. The bathroom was being used less frequently. One of the researchers, a man named Dr. Coleman, noted in his report that the subjects seemed to be shutting down non-essential functions. But they weren't sleeping. They couldn't. Their eyes stayed open. Wide open. Staring. On the afternoon of day 9, Subject C walked to the center of the room and announced to no one in particular that he understood now. That he could see what they couldn't see. That sleep was the prison, and they had been freed. The others didn't respond. But, slowly, one by one, they nodded. That's when the real horror began. Day 10. Subject A, who had finally stopped doing push-ups, approached the observation window. He moved right up to the glass, so close his breath fogged it. And he smiled. Not a normal smile. Something wrong. Something that made the three researchers watching take an involuntary step back. He stood there for several minutes, just smiling, and then he spoke. He said they were listening. That they could hear everything now. Every thought. Every lie. Every fear in the researchers' heads. He said they knew the truth. About the experiment. That it wasn't about sleep at all. It was about seeing what they would become. And they were becoming it. Then he asked, very calmly, if the researchers would like to join them. To stop sleeping. To see what they had seen. Dr. Coleman ordered the intercom turned off. Over the next 24 hours, the screaming started again. But this time it was different. It wasn't panicked. Or desperate. It was synchronized. All 5 subjects screaming together, in perfect unison, a sound so unified it seemed to come from a single throat. It went on for hours. Then stopped abruptly. Then started again. The researchers couldn't determine if it was intentional or some kind of shared psychological break. The working theory was that severe sleep deprivation had caused mass psychosis, a rare but documented phenomenon. But the precision of it, the timing, it suggested something else. Something organized. Day 12. Silence. Complete and total silence. The subjects weren't moving. Weren't talking. Weren't screaming. They were positioned throughout the chamber, standing or sitting, perfectly still. Their eyes were open. The cameras confirmed they were breathing. But that was all. They looked like statues. Like something had reached inside them and pulled out whatever made them human, leaving only the shells behind. The researchers debated whether to end the experiment early. Dr. Coleman argued they needed to see it through. They were so close to the 15-day mark. To valuable data. The others reluctantly agreed. They decided to wait. That decision still haunts every document related to this case. Because what happened on day 13 changed everything. It started with Subject B, who had been standing facing the wall for what the time logs indicate was 63 hours straight. He moved. Slowly, he lifted his right hand to his face. And then, with his fingernails, he began to scratch. Not idly. Not like an itch. He dug his nails into the skin of his cheek and pulled down. Hard. The wound opened. Blood ran down his neck. And he didn't stop. He kept scratching, kept digging, like he was trying to peel his face off. The researchers hit the emergency alert. prepared to flood the chamber with sedative gas. But before they could, Subject B stopped, turned around, and smiled with a mouth full of blood. He was crying. Not from pain. From something else. From relief. Then the others began. Subject D used a fork from one of the meal trays. Subject E used his own teeth, biting into his forearm until the skin broke. Subject C found a way to dislocate his own thumb, then popped it back in. Then did it again. Over and over. The sound of it echoing through the chamber. Subject A did nothing. Just watched. The researchers were screaming into the intercom now, ordering them to stop, threatening to terminate the experiment. The subjects didn't respond. Didn't even acknowledge the voices. They were somewhere else. Now. Somewhere the researchers couldn't reach them. Day 14. The chamber looked like something from a nightmare. Blood on the walls. On the floor. Smeared. In patterns that almost looked intentional. The subjects had stopped the overt self-mutilation, but the damage was done. They were injured, some severely, but they didn't seem to care. Didn't tend to their wounds. Didn't ask for medical attention. They just existed in that space, moving slowly, deliberately, like dancers following choreography only they could hear. At one point, all five gathered in the center of the room. They stood in a circle, facing each other, not speaking, not touching, just standing there for hours. The researchers couldn't explain it. Couldn't rationalize it. This had gone far beyond sleep deprivation. This was something else. On the morning of day 15, Dr. Coleman made the decision to end the experiment. They would open the chamber, sedate the subjects if necessary, and get them immediate medical attention. The plan was simple. Pump in sedative gas. Wait for the subjects to lose consciousness. Enter with a medical team. Extract them one by one. But when they activated the gas, nothing happened. The subjects didn't fall unconscious. Didn't even seem drowsy. They just stood there, breathing normally, looking up at the vents like they were curious about something. After 20 minutes of continuous gas flow, enough to knock out a horse, all five subjects were still awake. Still standing. Still watching. They had no choice now. They had to go in manually. A team of 6 armed soldiers was assembled, along with 2 medics. They wore gas masks and protective gear. The plan was to restrain the subjects, inject them with powerful sedatives, and remove them from the chamber. When the door was opened, 3 of the subjects immediately rushed it. Not to escape. To attack. They moved with inhuman speed, with a strength that shouldn't have been possible given their physical condition. One soldier was knocked unconscious in the first 10 seconds. Another was bitten on the neck. The subjects weren't trying to run. They were trying to keep the door open. They were screaming for the soldiers to come inside. To stop sleeping. To join them in the chamber. To see what they had seen. It took 15 minutes to subdue them. 3 subjects were injected with enough sedative to kill a normal person. They didn't die. They didn't even pass out. They just became slower. Weaker. 2 of them were finally restrained and dragged from the chamber. Subject A, who had remained calm throughout the entire assault, walked out on his own. Subject D and Subject E refused to leave. When soldiers tried to force them, they held onto the walls, the floor, anything they could grip. Subject D kept repeating that they couldn't leave. That if they left, they would have to go back to sleep. And if they went back to sleep, they would stop existing. The soldiers didn't understand. They just pulled harder. The extraction took 45 minutes. By the end, all 5 subjects were outside the chamber, restrained on gurneys, still awake despite the chemical cocktail in their systems. That's when Subject A spoke for the last time. One of the medics asked him, trying to be comforting, trying to be kind, told him it was over now, he could finally rest. And Subject A turned his head, looked directly at the medic with those bloodshot, unblinking eyes, and said, "We are not who you think we are. We were close. We almost remembered. And you brought us back to this prison." Then he closed his eyes. Not to sleep. Not to rest. He just closed them. And when the medics checked his pulse, there was none. He had stopped. Just stopped. No heart attack. No stroke. His body simply decided it was done. The other 4 were transported to a secure medical facility. Subject B died 6 hours later. Subject C died the next morning. Both from multi-organ failure that doctors couldn't explain. Their bodies just shut down, one system at a time, like machines being switched off. Subject D survived for 3 days. He never slept. Never closed his eyes. Not once. The medical staff tried everything. Sedatives. Anesthesia. Nothing worked. On the 3rd day, he began to laugh. A soft, whispering laugh that went on for hours. Then he stopped breathing. Subject E was the last. He lived for 2 weeks after leaving the chamber. He didn't speak. Didn't eat. Just sat in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. On the final day, a nurse entered his room and found him sitting up, looking directly at her. He asked her a question. He asked if she had ever really looked at sleep. Really examined what it was. He told her that sleep wasn't rest. It was something else. Something old. Something that lived in the spaces between consciousness. And the experiment hadn't kept them awake. It had freed them from it. Then he died. Just like the others. His body simply gave up. The official reports state that all 5 subjects died from complications related to extreme sleep deprivation and the experimental stimulant used in the chamber. The project was immediately classified. All personnel involved were reassigned. Dr. Coleman disappeared from public record entirely. The chamber was dismantled. The base was decommissioned the following year. For decades, Project Somnus existed only as a rumor, a story told in certain military circles, always dismissed as fiction. But the files exist. Or they existed. Most have been destroyed. But a few survived, passed from person to person, copied and recopied until the originals were lost. What you've heard today comes from those surviving documents. From testimonies that were never supposed to be read. From evidence of an experiment that was never supposed to happen. But here's what keeps me awake at night. In the final report, one of the junior researchers included an observation that was later redacted. He wrote that on day 14, while reviewing the footage from inside the chamber, he noticed something strange. The subjects weren't just standing in silence. They were listening. All 5 of them, perfectly still, heads tilted at the exact same angle, like they were hearing something the microphones couldn't pick up. And in the last frame before the tape ended, just for a moment, their expressions changed. They smiled. All of them. At the exact same time. Not the smile of madness. The smile of recognition. Like they had finally heard what they'd been waiting for. And it had answered back. The experiment was erased. The chamber was destroyed. The men who participated are dead. But sometimes, late at night, in facilities that conduct sleep research, in hospitals with sleep disorder clinics, in military bases, where soldiers train to stay awake for days at a time, something strange happens. People report hearing whispers, laughter, the sound of 5 voices speaking in perfect unison. And those who hear it, those who really listen, they say the same thing. They say it sounds like an invitation to stop sleeping, to remember what the men in that chamber remembered, to understand what they understood in those final days. The government says Project Somnus never existed. They're probably right. But if that's true, then what are we still listening for? And what's listening back? And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves creepy stories, and don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon, because this is just the beginning. The next story might be darker, and you won't want to miss it.